Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Reyzl Grace, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a University of Maryland professor of public policy. We also have with us Dr. Nia Johnson, who's a visiting assistant professor of law at Duke. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the deputy general counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our show. You know, when we think about religious freedom, sometimes we focus simply on activities in the United States, but it's also critical that we think about things that we see happening internationally, because the world has gotten so global and issues that may be in somebody else's backyard may one day be in your backyard. You know, on a recent Sunday, there were about a dozen individuals that were trying to go to church in a small town in Rwanda, and they were looking to try to figure out what to do next, because the government came in and basically shut down their service and said they could no longer engage in service because the place where they were worshiping did not have the proper safety, the proper hygiene, facilities that were there, and also an infrastructure that they deemed to be safe. Now, many of these individuals felt as though that this was something that was just being put upon them because of their religious beliefs, and they found themselves in a position where they felt as though they had to actually engage in worship and engage in it in a silent way. You know, we look at the president there who's done a lot of good things, but there's also been a lot of questions regarding what do we do when we start to see issues coming up from a religious standpoint and whether or not a government or an international government has gone too far. You know, Bettina, when you take a look at some of these type of issues, and you being somebody who's worked locally and also internationally, and we start to see these issues that come up where sometimes you can see how you can kind of infringe on religion and put it in a nice box that sounds like you're really doing things to protect individuals, and maybe you actually are, but how do you find the right balance to make sure that things are moving in the right direction?
Well, here's the problem, Orlan, with trying to pass judgment on what's happening in a country that's half a world away. And that is, we really don't have complete information about what's happening on the ground there in Rwanda. Because if we were having this conversation in the context of the US, then we would say something like, well, of course churches need to have restroom facilities. Of course they need to comply with the fire safety regulations. That's not religious discrimination. These are neutral laws that exist for a good reason. They're not burdening the free exercise of religion per se. But here's the thing. We can't necessarily make those assumptions in the context of Rwanda. Number one, you know, these are some of the things that give me some concern. The scale of the shutdown of churches, some 10,000 were closed at the same time. The fact that some of these closures seem to disproportionately impact certain minority religious groups. The fact that there are a number of red flags about the president of Rwanda himself and his willingness to use the power of the state in ways that infringe on human rights like political expression. And also the fact that with these closures, the government is also seeking greater regulation of religion in areas of finance, in areas even of educational requirements for clergy. All those things raise red flags and tell me that the international community should be watching closely as to what happens in the future.
Well, Sharon, what's your thoughts on this? I mean, one of the interesting things is you have a president like Kagame who has been the one who basically turned around a lot of the things that were happening in a really terrible fashion, 30, 40 years ago in Rwanda, and who even wanted to step aside politically. And basically the country were like, please don't leave. We need you here. And part of what he's trying to do, I think, is to put things in a proper fashion. And that city is probably considered to be one of the cleanest cities in the world. So on one hand, you see that we've got these rules and regulations that look like they're positive, but how do we kind of juxtapose this?
I think it's everything you just said. You have a leader who has actually turned things around, and for all practical purposes, from the international community, looks like he's doing a great job and moving the country forward. You also have a place that now folks from all around the world are coming in to invest, to see, and to be a part of, including at the federal, state, and local level. You've seen the emergence of sister cities throughout Rwanda. Herein lies the problem with that cleanup, especially around religious freedom and the fact that you have a multi religious community in Rwanda. You start to you have to really now be careful, like we would be in the United States, and that is the more you try to crack down and make sure people are following rules, you have to make sure it is not so burdensome that those who practice another faith can't actually do that. And that's where the fear is right now. And I'll just close with this. The problem it has for those of us who are not in Rwanda is that the world is smaller. We all, trade and visit each other. And so for the United States and for those of us here, what's going on there, especially around religious freedom, has an impact on how we deal with them.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, I think part of the other challenge here, especially when we talk about the developing world, especially as it pertains to religion, but also their positioning in the international sphere, is that, a lot of countries in the developing world find themselves always having to pander to Western sensibilities. So they always need to look like they're doing things in a way that's considered, quote unquote, the right way, which usually means the Western way. And so again, he's getting rave reviews in the Western world, given how he has cleaned up Rwanda, especially after, or rather in the wake of the genocide in the 90s. He's been able to kind of turn it around and make this look like something that's really legitimate. However, what traditional Western ideals don't always translate into the developing world, for better or for worse, until you have other parameters. I think nowadays, there's generally a global concern about the encroachment of power of our leaders, a rise in authoritarian regimes. We've seen, for example, South Korea be under martial law for a period of time towards the end of 2024. And so I think there's already a natural kind of anxiety around what leaders are doing and how they are crafting laws to oppress. But I would also like to remind us that, this isn't necessarily new. There have always been really good purposes for laws, but also laws with ulterior motives, and both of those can exist on the same plane. But I do think that this may be a really good time, like Bettina was saying earlier, just to watch, and not, try to cast judgment, disperse judgment, specifically on the developing world, because they are living with a different set of circumstances that I think many of us who like to commentate on these things actually get to and understand.
Todd, when you think about, international religious freedom, and we think about things from a U.S. perspective, there are many that say to themselves, well, this is important that here in the United States we get involved. Should it, quote unquote, be looking to find environments or create environments that feel like the same level of religious freedom here in the Western Hemisphere? Or is there basically somewhat of an understanding that when you live in a different world, sometimes you have to operate a little bit differently?
Certainly, religious freedom needs to be put in the context of the countries around the world. What works in the United States may not work in a different country. However, we have international covenants on this and international agreements, and those need to be respected. And the United States and all countries, as part of an international order, especially one where we put a lot of humanitarian aid in, should be upholding these principles. It's in our statutes. It's in our First Amendment. We should be supporting this around the world. So it's not inappropriate for the U.S., and especially for U.S. advocates, to be holding Rwanda accountable on this. But again, you shouldn't try to impose a U.S.-style religious freedom, but that doesn't mean that there is no religious freedom. I would also like to point out, in defense of, not defense, but it's not just Rwanda and it's not just other parts of the world that use otherwise neutral rules to try to friend on religion. There's a county in Maryland that once they got their hands slapped for denying a zoning permit to a church, then tried to pull the stunt of, well, we won't give you your sewer permit, right, which normally is a neutral thing. And they tried to do that twice. And the courts in both circumstances shut them down. So, it isn't just Africa that tries to misuse these neutral rules, right? If that's what's going on in Rwanda, it's bureaucrats worldwide love to abuse their power.
Right, absolutely, Todd. China is the prime example of this because the Constitution of China provides, a very broad expression of religious freedom and guarantees that in the Constitution. But religion is tightly controlled through these apparently neutral regulatory processes. China is an example of this. Many countries in Eastern Europe where the Orthodox Church holds a majority, they also use this sort of registration requirements for minority religious groups to control and exclude disfavored religious faith communities. So there is definitely, this whole idea of, well, we're doing this for a good purpose. We have a legitimate aim for this regulation. To a large extent, we need to be prepared to look underneath those claims and to find out what's happening substantively, not just what's happening on the surface. I also wanted to touch briefly on the whole idea of religious freedom being a Western construct. Yes, to a certain extent, it does come out of a Western way of viewing law and human rights. But then, countries, as Todd said, voluntarily enter into international covenants. And so when the US or other countries make complaints about religious freedom or make inquiries about what's happening on the ground in other countries, they're not trying to impose an external or alien idea. They're simply holding those countries to account for what they have freely entered into. And so I think that is an important part of what the international community does, raising awareness of where these international covenants are being violated.
Well, and I would say that would be how we have to make sure that we're balancing all the time. One of the other things that the president talked about was the possibility of even starting to tax churches. And when we start seeing churches that are moving to be organizations that people on the outside will look at and say, it looks a lot less like a church and a lot more like a business, this is a battle I think we're going to continue to see going on and on and on. But it'll be interesting to see what happens internationally as compared to the Western world. In the case of Reyzl Grace versus Holy Angels and the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, we have a lawsuit that was filed, which was discrimination that's being talked about as it relates to the Academy of Holy Angels, which is a Catholic high school that's in Richfield, Minnesota. And what ended up happening in this case is we have a staff librarian that's basically being put in a position where she came out as being trans. And the lawsuit alleges that the Holy Angels violated the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And as a result, we find ourselves in a situation where an individual who claims to be a secular librarian at the school is now not being allowed to renew her contract because of her trans status and her sexual activities. And as a result thereof, we're not sure where the courts are going to end up with this, but this is the battle that's taking place. Todd, when you see a matter like this, where the question is really being asked of, how religious or how connected to your religion do you need to be in order to be an employee? Someone here is a staff librarian. People have other positions along those lines as well. What is so critical about this? Why ensuring that an employee actually may be living in compliance with your religious beliefs if they may not be, quote unquote, directly connected to, quote unquote, the religious work that you do at your organization?
Because when you're setting a school, it's not just what happens in the classroom. I mean, I went to religious schools all the way up through college. It's the culture that you're in. And many times the people that you can have a connection to may be not classroom people. Librarians in many situations can be who that student connects with. They'll have an impact. They also have an impact in culture. They're at staff meetings. They're involved in, extracurricular activities many times. They're part of the community. And religious organizations have a right to create the community to educate their kids in the way they see fit. Supreme Court has said you have the right to send your kid to a parochial school, Society of Sisters versus Peers. Well, if you have the right to send that, the church also has a concomitant right to create the culture, and that means hiring people who are part of their faith, or and not in support their faith in the way that they conduct themselves. I also want to address one of the things I think this librarian says. Well, listen, this is a secular job. You don't even require to be part of this faith. Like, I can do the work of this. And you don't require to be religious in other ways. But the Supreme Court has said you don't have to just simply limit it to members of your faith. You can also require those people to uphold your beliefs in ways, and you can kind of pick and choose which of those and how you do this, and not make it just members of the faith.
Yeah, I would also like to come in here. I mean, I think part of the challenge is something that we talk about a lot on this show, which is that when organizations, specifically religious organizations, tend to grow, and what I would personally say dabble in some more secular institutions, and they start being treated like secular institutions. When you take on wanting to employ many members of society, they will go through, various shifts in their faith and ideology and their beliefs, and they may also align very heavily with your mission, but not necessarily aligned with every aspect of your beliefs. I would also like to add that there, is a whole, branch of theology, that looks towards LGBTQ issues, folks who identify, in the queer theology space, who have been exploring these issues. And there is a strand of belief in a number of different religions that, the idea of being, well, not the idea, but the state of being trans or, or going through a transition, it does not necessarily misalign with whatever religious text some institutions are using. And so, to also act like this is not a strand of theology that exists, that people are not exposed to, that also hasn't branched off of a number of different institutions, is also privileging a very specific type of Christianity. And so, I think that this is something that's always challenging for religious organizations, going back to Todd's point. I agree. I think a lot of religious schools are designed in some capacity to indoctrinate. But I think one of the many challenges that parochial schools have dealt with and will continue to deal with is that you can't control every aspect of people's lives. And, yes, parents, I think this is something that we love to do, or they love to do, to maintain that level of control. But once you start releasing people from those institutions and from those spaces, it becomes a lot harder to actually police what they do, especially if you want to hire good talent. And a lot of good talent is secular. So you do have to toe that line.
I was going to say, just real quickly, I agree with Nina. I think what we see is, as the faith community goes, especially the schools, you're hiring outside of your faith. And so the question becomes not whether, in fact, you can hold people accountable to whatever your religious belief is there a pattern of you going outside of that? Have you set up a situation when people are coming in that they're not actually held to the standard that you did in the beginning? So in this case, if the librarian came in, and to know that whether, in fact, here's what we believe in, here's what we expect you to do. And that has been shown throughout the years with every other employee. If you start deviating from that and saying, hey, we're going to make exceptions here, there on our religious belief, because we really want this talent in IT or library services, then I think that's where you start to get into trouble, because it is this convergence now. Nobody is, whether they're secular or they're in the faith community, totally within hiring within that religious group. And I think that's the problem. Notice of what it's going to be like when you sign up to work there, and do the rules change in midstream on you. And I think that's where problems arise.
It's interesting, Orlan, in cases such as this, usually there's a contractual issue involved as well. And in the case of teachers and staff in wholly religious schools, that contract usually includes a provision that says employees must conduct themselves in a way that upholds, doesn't oppose the religious beliefs of this organization. And so I think sometimes it's disingenuous for folk who enter into these employment relationships with an institution they know is religious. They know what the standards are for expected behavior of those involved in the mission of that organization, and then to later claim that they should not be discriminated against because they act in a way that contravenes those standards. That's one point. The second point is that religious schools exist only for one reason, and that is because they are religious. They have a religious mission. And so it is way outside the pay grade of a judge, of a lawyer, of a member of the EEOC to make any kind of judgment about how that religious school should carry out its religious mission. If the First Amendment means anything at all, it means that.
So one of the things, that's important, if you look at the release that was done by the institute that's doing this, at the bottom they say in all bold, they quote the Second Vatican Council, talk about it's to proclaim and establish the reign of God, and then they say discriminating against LGBTQ people, like the plaintiff here, is a countersign to that mission, is itself a cause for scandal. And scandal is a very specific term that Catholics use, and where what she was accused of doing here. The problem with this is they are attacking the theology of the Catholic Church. When you try to use the Second Vatican Council to support and say you should do this, as a Catholic theological matter, they may be right. I'm not going to opine on Catholic theology, but you should not be using the court to do this. One last thing I will agree with. Many times, I don't think our Catholic brothers in Christ have done the best job they could in explaining this and making it clear up front and making the rules known even to their own administrators. There has been a pattern of the school and the community, even the school administrator will be fine with this, and then the bishop becomes aware of it and comes in and puts in the Catholic theology. That's their legal right, and they shouldn't be sued over that, but there can be an improvement there in making sure their administrators and the expectations are made clear up front.
Well, and this ties back to the point of talent, right? At the end of the day, like as much as, religious schools, like you said, Bettina, exist, for the purposes of religion, that they also exist as a business as well, right? Like the way that you get people to go to your schools is by promising great test scores, great career outcomes. Yes, you may want, children to be educated in a specific type of religious environment, but there is a deeply secular purpose, right? Like, children are not going to Catholic school to solely work for the Catholic Church, right? Just like children are not going to Lutheran schools solely to work for the Lutheran Church. This has a business purpose. You want your children to leave and be doctors, lawyers, etc. And these institutions also have a goal of teaching children how to interact with people outside of their faith, which is why you have Catholic schools that will make these type of declarations on their contracts and saying how we're going to treat people. How do we take on matters of social justice? So I think that's very important to keep in mind. But the other piece of this that I think is really important, and this takes us a little bit outside of the law and probably moves us a little bit more into philosophy, sociology a little bit, is that, part of the other issue here is that this individual was transitioning publicly, right? And so when we think about all of the other quieter and less public ways that people may not be in perfect alignment with their religion, they are not in danger of losing their jobs. And so really, this is the issue that religious organizations always deal with, where it's like you penalize the person who is the most front facing, you penalize the person who is engaging in something publicly, but then you have to deal with the internal hypocrisy. And those are the things that actually erode the systems from the inside out. Because again, going back to, what really seems to be a core issue here is that you cannot control every aspect of folks' personal lives. Even as a religious organization, even if you hold, no pun intended, hell and high water over them, there are some things that are genuinely outside of your control. And this will always be the friction that happens in educational spaces, especially when they want to dabble in the business of getting children good test scores and good jobs.
If I could just say, I think Todd hit it. And that is a lot of times because of what Nina just said, that you want to get talent. What you do is you overlook, you turn the blind eye to little infractions. That's where you're going to get into problems, because once you do that, you're starting down that slippery slope because you do want those talented people in there. And then when the person who is, more front facing does something, you go, aha. But it's usually not the first incident. Somebody knew in that school, in that church, this was happening, or this person believed this. And so if you're going to do this, if you're going to have these standards, you have to hold to them and make sure you're not breaking them. That's where you're going to get into legal questions and legal problems, and people will sue on it.
I'm going to let that be the last word. But the irony of all of this is that the requirement seems to be consistency. And when you can be consistent from a religious standpoint and be upfront with what is required at the beginning, you have a little bit less of this battle. But I think there's going to be an ongoing friction between what we would call employment and religion, especially as things start to get a little bit different in terms of what religious organizations are willing to tolerate. Hey, Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Back in May of 2024, the Minnesota legislature restored an exemption for religious organizations to trans discrimination. So I also have to be one of the things that, in the case we're talking about before, that they're challenging.
Wow. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, mine is also a law in Minnesota passed last year, but it's slightly different. It makes it illegal for landowners to consume a nuisance beaver that they trap because it was doing damage on their property.
Did not know that one. Rashard, tell me something I don't know.
Mine is about a lawyer. Did you know Abraham Lincoln is one of the few presidents, I believe the only one, that actually had a patent that he filed with the patent office to lift boats over shores, something he did when he was young. So yes, he is, in addition to being a great president, he is an inventor.
Wow. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So did you know that rural hospital closures are more likely to affect Black individuals and Latina individuals, even more than white folks, in the midst of the debate about rural hospital closures and how that impacts white American health?
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us. It was a great talk today and looking forward to doing this again soon. And thank you again for being here with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time. Hello, I'm Orlin Johnson. I'm the host of Faith and Politics, your ultimate destination for a broad range of religious and political current events. Join me in a panel of experts as we dive into the latest religious news, dissect significant legal decisions, and navigate the complexities of politics. Stay informed, stay engaged, subscribe now.
I think we need to be diligent in protecting the constitutional rights of our citizens.
That's the problem with any study of this kind, which seeks such a one-dimensional understanding of what religious freedom is.
It was to give someone the right to make this choice according to the dictates of their conscience.
But how do you parse exactly what is someone's personal belief or their political slant or their religious belief?
When we look out for the rights of a few of us, we ultimately end up looking out for the rights of many of us.